Friends of Egerton Ryerson presents.
Words from Egerton Ryerson.
Part 1.
Hello, my name is Egerton Ryerson. What you're seeing is a sketch of me done in 1838 when I was 35 years old. What you're not seeing is me. The reason is, as some of you will know, I died in 1882, so you really wouldn't want to see me now. The reason I'm here is that in the last few years, a number of people have said really nasty things about me. For well over 100 years, I've had a sterling reputation, and now it's destroyed in the minds of many people. These accusations made against me are based on misrepresentations, lies, untruths. I'm here in the ether, in the air, to set the record straight. And we're going to start with a few comments by me on my early life. As we go through, you will see pictures of me as I aged, so you can get an idea of what I was like at the time. My father fought for the king during the American Revolutionary War, and at the end of the war, like many loyalists, he felt he had to leave. He went first to New Brunswick, where he married, and then went to Upper Canada, what you now know as Ontario. He received a large amount of land because he was a loyalist officer in the Revolutionary War. On part of this, he created a farm, a bush farm. It would have looked something like this. It was located north of Lake Erie. I was born in 1803, and as I grew up, I was strong, I had great endurance, and I was perfect for working the farm. I worked very hard, but I and my 3 elder brothers, and eventually my younger brother, all felt the call. We all wanted to join the Methodist Church. My father, on the other hand, was a member of the Church of England. My mother was a Methodist and very devout. We took inspiration from her. My father was very unhappy about me joining the Methodist Church. This all took place shortly after the War of 1812 or after 1815. I had a falling out with my father over this issue and actually left home for 2 years, but eventually we reconciled. I was taken on as an apprentice in the Methodist Church in 1825 when my elder brother William became ill and couldn't discharge his duties as a circuit rider. So I apprenticed as a circuit rider, as a minister, and was put on the Yonge Street circuit, which took me all the way up to Lake Simcoe, around and back down to York, the capital, now Toronto. So I would preach in different places on different days. It was a good experience to learn how to preach. In 1827, I was ordained officially as a minister. But by that time, I had already achieved some notoriety and made some good friends. I went after knowledge in my youth, in fact, my whole life. The same way I worked on the farm, I gave it my all. I wanted to know. I studied with learned men when I could find them, and when I couldn't, I read. I read voraciously. I studied the English language. I studied religion. I studied moral philosophy. I studied political philosophy, a whole range of things. But none of that prepared me for my next posting with the Methodist Church. In 1826, I was appointed as a minister to the Credit Mission. The Credit Mission was a settlement of the Mississauga people at the mouth of the Credit River. The Mississaugas were a branch of the Ojibwe people, who were one of the groups making up the Anishinaabe. In the 18th century, the Mississaugas ranged across a huge area from what is now Scarborough all the way out past Long Point on Lake Erie. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, a series of treaties gave this land away. The Mississaugas, as with Indigenous people generally, did not have the same concept of ownership of land as did the white settlers. They saw themselves as simply using the land. So when they started signing treaties with the government, they thought they were agreeing to share the land. but of course the government thought it was buying the land. The Mississaugas, as with most Indigenous people across the colony of Upper Canada, now Ontario, fell on hard times as a result of this. As settlers moved in, the hunting and fishing lands gradually disappeared, and Indigenous people started to lose heart. They pursued their way of life less and less. They spent more and more time drinking and in idleness. This, combined with disease, meant that the number of Indigenous people in the colony was shrinking. In 1825, a young man pictured here on the left, the son of a white man and an Indigenous woman, embraced Christianity and Methodism. His name, in his native Mississauga language, was Kakakawanabe, or in English that translates as sacred feathers or sacred waving feathers. In English, he was known as Peter Jones, and he was to become a friend of mine. In 1826, along with the help of others, he established a Christian community of about 200 Mississaugas at the mouth of the Credit River, out of a total population of about 500 Mississaugas. The land around them had all been surrendered in treaties. You can see with the purple outline and the yellow outline, this had recently been surrendered. Since no one was on it, the Mississauga assumed that it was theirs to use. So they set up farms. They set up a community at the mouth of the Credit River, and the government helped them to build the community. Peter Jones spent his life trying to protect his people and to spread the gospel. And the way he believed that they would survive was if they took up farming. And that's why this community was established. Peter Jones was an early convert to the idea of schools where people could go and learn agriculture. From his travels in the United States, he became convinced that this is the way that people could learn to farm. These schools would be in addition to the mission schools which existed in most Indigenous communities. So they set up farms, and every person had a garden and 50 acres that they could farm. And for the rest of his life, Peter Jones spread the gospel and spread the idea that Indigenous people could survive and prosper if they adopted the farming way of life. I was not prepared for being immersed in this culture, but I took to it. I was a farmer after all. These people were just starting out in farming, so I helped them. And again, I had this prodigious energy, so I could work long hours in the fields with them. And I made the effort to learn enough of their language so I could preach to them. And they were happy with this. In fact, in a ceremony, they gave me the name of a recently deceased and highly regarded chief, Chichok. I love these people. I loved being with them, even though I only stayed less than a year before I was appointed elsewhere. So they thanked me with this name. If you go through Toronto, you won't find the Ryerson name very much anymore, but you will find, if you hunt, my Mississauga name, Chichok. Have a look. So Peter Jones became chief of the Mississaugas, and he became my lifelong best friend. Until his death in 1856, we spread the gospel together. Now, it's fashionable in some circles today to say, oh yes, they wanted to convert the natives to Christianity to destroy their culture. They put one over on them. Well, this is really, really demeaning to Indigenous people, to say they didn't know what they wanted and they somehow were talked into taking up this religion that was so foreign to them. This really says they weren't smart enough to know what they wanted. Of course they knew what they wanted. By the mid-1830s, almost all the indigenous people in what is now southern Ontario had taken up the Christian religion. The other thing that is said is, oh, this was destroying their culture. This is why the white man wanted to give Christianity to the First Nations, to destroy their culture. Well, this didn't destroy their culture. They kept their clothing, they kept their habits, they kept their customs. All they did was add to it. They already had a great spirit. Now they had God. There were formalities that went with this religion. There are beliefs that went with this, but they simply added them to what they already had. So to suggest that we missionaries intended to destroy their culture, to assimilate them, is nonsense. Here are some sketches done at the time of the village at the Credit Mission. These buildings were erected by the government for the people of the settlement. On the top left, you have the house and study of Peter Jones. On the right, you have the house of his brother John, who helped him establish the community. And on the bottom, you have the houses inhabited by the rest of the population. 2 families to a house, and each family had 50 acres that they could farm. They also had a combined school and church. They had a mill. They sawed lumber, and they had a boat to transport it to Toronto. They had plans to establish a harbor so ships could land and they could carry on a trade with the interior. Unfortunately, as I will point out, the settlement did not last indefinitely, so they didn't have a chance to fully develop the area. But it was very successful up into the 1840s. And it was based on hard work and the Christian religion. This is what Methodist ministers preached. And by the mid-30s, there are about 40 Methodist indigenous ministers, plus other people like deacons who worked in the churches. Their whole idea was that people should work hard and abstain from alcohol. This is what the Methodist ministers preached. And the community was free of alcohol. Peter Jones saw alcohol, and indeed other ministers had the same view, including myself, that people had to avoid alcohol and work hard. And this is what the Christian religion taught. So they worked hard, they didn't drink, and the community prospered. And this is what Methodist ministers who worked with Indigenous people tried to create. A way that Indigenous people, First Nations, could survive in the long run. While I was living with the Mississaugas, I became involved in a controversy. And this carried on for the next couple of years while I was on missionary circuits in Eastern Upper Canada and in Western Upper Canada. I found that life rewarding but difficult. Almost every night staying with somebody else, never having my own spot, always moving. And this controversy that I became involved in made my reputation and changed me from a circuit rider to a promoter of knowledge. The man you see here is John Strachan. He was the Anglican Archdeacon of York, the capital. He was a man considered to have a large intellect, and he put forth in 1826 a printed argument that the Anglicans, the Church of England, should control a large amount of land set aside by the government to support the Protestant Church. That the Anglicans should be in charge of education, that they should be allowed to solemnize marriage, not the Methodists. He argued that the Methodists had connections in the United States, that they were disloyal, and they were few in number. In fact, They were far more Methodist than were members of the Church of England. I took them on. I argued against this idea of having a state church, the Church of England, of it getting the money from what's called the clergy reserves, about them having an almost exclusive right to marry people, of them being in charge of the school system, which they were as of 1823. My arguments were very effective, and they brought me to the attention of a much broader audience. In 1829, I was appointed as the first editor of the Christian Guardian, a new Methodist newspaper. The Christian Guardian was a newspaper for the Methodist, but it was also a newspaper that contained information that all settlers would be interested in and all Indigenous people would be interested in. Under my editorship, I was editor for most of the 1830s, the Christian Guardian expanded its readership exponentially. I became well known. Yes, we published information about the Methodist Church, but we also published information about religion in general and about conditions in a frontier province. And we gave the people a chance to contribute, so they could write a letter to the Guardian. Many of these letters came from Indigenous people. We had by this time, as I mentioned, about 40 missionaries who were Indigenous and other people who served as officials in the church, and they wrote in and talked about conditions in the colony. So the Indigenous way of life remained in people's minds. I did not forget about my Mississauga brothers. On a trip to England to raise money for work with Indigenous people, I tried to reach the Queen to argue in favor of the Mississaugas keeping their land. The land was threatened at the time by the local governor in Upper Canada. I was not successful, but I did try. I also promoted the careers of Indigenous people who'd shown themselves to be really good students. Because of the controversy between the Methodist Church and the Anglican Church, or Church of England as we knew it, a conference of Methodists in 1830 decided to build our own school. This is Upper Canada Academy, which you see here. It was begun in 1832 with money raised from among Methodists. We ran out of money and we had to raise more. And it was completed in 1836, and I became the first president. However, in 1837-38, I had to go to England to raise more money to keep the school going. It was this same trip in which I, along with 3 other missionaries, that is, Indigenous missionaries, raised money for our Indian missions. And this is the time when I approached Queen Victoria, or attempted to approach Queen Victoria, to try and get a guarantee for the Mississauga lands. The government had abandoned the idea of confiscating Indigenous lands, but it became quite indifferent to the credit mission. As white settlers moved in, they had no respect for the property rights of the Mississauga, and it became very difficult for the community to carry on as it was crowded out. In 1847, Peter Jones, who had a Mohawk name as well as a Mississauga name and had good relations with the Mohawks, arranged to move his people from the credit to the Grand River Mission, where it resides to this day. In 1841, we secured a charter from Queen Victoria to change this from a preparatory school for university to a university. This became Victoria University. It admitted both white and Indigenous people. Even though it was a Methodist school, we had no restrictions on who could attend. And it became quite successful. This really began my direct involvement with education, which had always been an interest of mine. In 1840, I was given a position in Toronto, but in 1844, I embarked on a new part of my career, one which would bring me to international prominence.